There's a voice that has narrated the universe itself. A voice that told us about hope through prison bars, about dignity through suffering, about redemption through despair. That voice belongs to Morgan Freeman. But what if I told you the man who gave voice to God on screen couldn't save himself from the cruelest hands life could deal? At 88, he sits alone on a Mississippi porch, $250 million in the bank, 2 broken marriages behind him, a granddaughter buried too soon, and a hand that no longer obeys him. The compression glove he wears isn't fashion. It's a prison. The man who taught us that hope is a good thing, maybe the best of things, now lives with pain as his only constant companion. Before we descend into the shadow behind the voice that steadied a generation, ask yourself, how does a man who narrates everyone else's salvation story lose his own? The answer will break your heart. June 1st, 1937. Memphis, Tennessee. A boy enters the world already marked for abandonment. Morgan Freeman was the youngest of 5 children born to parents who barely had enough to feed themselves, let alone a family. His mother scrubbed floors. His father cut hair in a shop that barely survived month to month. But here's what they don't tell you about poverty. It doesn't just steal your food, it steals your presence. When Morgan's parents left for Chicago, chasing work, chasing survival, chasing anything but their children, young Morgan was left behind in Charleston, Mississippi with his grandmother. Picture this: a small boy sitting on a creaking wooden porch in the suffocating southern heat, listening to church choirs in the distance, wondering why his parents chose opportunity over him. "I knew what it meant to be left behind," he'd later confess, his voice carrying that weight like a stone he'd carried for 8 decades. But here's the question that haunts this story. What happens to a child who learns that love is conditional, that presence is temporary, that even your own parents will choose survival over staying? The answer: they learn to become someone else. Someone necessary. Someone the world can't abandon because they're too valuable to lose. A battered suitcase became his closest companion. Mississippi to Indiana. Indiana to Illinois. Illinois back to Mississippi. Never long enough anywhere to belong. Always the new kid. Always the poor kid. Always the black kid. In a segregated South that branded him as less before he could prove he was more. At school, the books were torn and outdated. The classrooms neglected. The message clear: children like him weren't expected to rise. "I felt like a second-class citizen in my own country," he'd admit decades later, still unable to hide the sting. But then at 9 years old, something happened that would change everything. A school stage. A small play. Scattered applause. And for one brief, shimmering moment, the lonely child felt seen. "This is what I want," he told himself. "This is who I am." But life wasn't done testing him. In 1961, his father died of cirrhosis. Morgan was only 24, barely a man himself. For a son who'd grown up in his father's absence, the death was still a wound that cut to the bone. It was a silence deeper than hunger, he'd recall. A reminder that even family can be taken in an instant. So let me ask you, if your childhood teaches you that love disappears, that people leave, that presence is a luxury, how do you ever learn to trust permanence? The answer shaped everything that followed. Barely out of high school, Morgan Freeman joins the Air Force, not because he wants to serve, because he has nowhere else to go. For a brief moment, he dreams of becoming a fighter pilot, flying above it all, untouchable, free. But when he finally sits in that cockpit, staring at instruments designed to deliver death, something inside him recoils. "I realized I wasn't meant to kill," he'd later admit. So he walks away from stability and steps into uncertainty, the most terrifying place for someone who'd grown up with nothing. Los Angeles. The Pasadena Playhouse. Days spent as a clerk, typing monotonous documents. Nights spent rehearsing lines nobody would pay to hear. His dinner? Stale bread and coffee so weak it was barely colored water. "I knew hunger," he'd confess. "I knew what it was like to live with nothing." But this wasn't childhood hunger. This was chosen hunger. The kind where you sacrifice everything for a dream that might never love you back. Casting directors wouldn't even look at him. Sometimes they'd dismiss him before he opened his mouth. His skin color was enough to end an audition before it began. So he drifted. Los Angeles. New York. San Francisco, always moving, always searching, always one rejection away from surrendering. In San Francisco he danced in chorus lines, sweating under stage lights for applause that barely covered rent. In New York, he stood in endless audition lines, each no pressing down like a stone on his chest. There were nights when surrender whispered to him, nights when giving up seemed like mercy rather than defeat. But he made himself a vow: I'll starve if I must, but I will act. Here's what's haunting about this chapter. Morgan Freeman spent 2 decades being invisible, rejected, forgotten, dismissed. By the time his first film appeared in 1971, he was already well into his 30s, an age when most actors had either succeeded or disappeared. Who Says I Can't Ride a Rainbow came and went without notice, his name lost in the credits like dust. Television brought survival, not glory. The electric company made him a familiar face to children, but in Hollywood he remained a ghost. Even his stage work, Obie Awards for Coriolanus, The Gospel at Colonus, Driving Miss Daisy, felt like applause in an empty theater. Recognition without reach. The question that defined this era: how long can a man fight for recognition before the world breaks him? For Morgan Freeman, the answer was longer than most humans can endure. Morgan Freeman is 50 years old, an age when most actors are fading from memory. And then street smart. His portrayal of Fast Black, a volatile pimp with surprising depth, wasn't just acting, it was a detonation. Critics who'd ignored him for decades suddenly couldn't look away. An Oscar nomination announced to the world: this man you've been overlooking. He's a force of nature, but recognition brought something darker: the weight of expectation. From that moment on, Freeman couldn't just be good. He had to be transcendent. Every time. In every role. Driving Miss Daisy 1989, the dignified chauffeur whose grace reminded the world that kindness is its own power. The Shawshank Redemption 1994, Red, the narrator whose calm voice turned a prison story into a hymn of hope that would comfort millions for decades. $1 Million Baby, 2004, the weary mentor whose compassion was forged in pain, finally earning him the Oscar that confirmed what audiences already knew. Invictus 2009, Nelson Mandela himself. I didn't choose this role, Freeman said. It chose me. But here's what nobody talks about. With every triumph came exhaustion. Nights that stretched past midnight. Call times at dawn. His 60s spent moving from set to set on aching legs, trading sleep for another scene, another truth, another moment of manufactured wisdom. I'll do it or die, he once confessed. It wasn't exaggeration. It was the price. Because Freeman had learned something cruel in those decades of rejection. If you stop performing, the world stops seeing you, and invisibility, for him, was a fate worse than death. So he kept going, past exhaustion, past pain, past the point where most men would beg for rest. The world crowned him with Kennedy Center honors, 2008 AFI Life Achievement, 2011, SAG Life Achievement, 2018. But here's the cruel irony. The higher they lifted him, the more isolated he became. Because legends aren't allowed to be human. They're not allowed to hurt, to fail, to break. And Morgan Freeman was about to break in ways no Oscar could repair. At 30 years old, with little more than unfulfilled dreams, Morgan Freeman marries Jeanette Adair Bradshaw. She sees him before the world does. Believes in him when casting directors won't even take his headshot. They build a modest home. He becomes a father to her daughter Dina, and to Alfonso, his son from an earlier relationship. Not the traditional nuclear family, but their family. For a man who'd known abandonment as a boy, this feels like redemption. Like finally building the stability he'd been denied. But here's what nobody warns you about. Love alone cannot withstand the weight of ambition. Freeman's nights disappear into rehearsals, auditions, performances that pay pennies but demand everything. He comes home exhausted, his mind still elsewhere, replaying lines, dissecting performances. Jeanette watches the man she loves vanish, not into another woman's arms, but into the relentless pursuit of something she can't compete with. Recognition. I was not always there the way a husband should be. Freeman would later admit. Work, the travel, the constant pursuit. It came between us. The meals grow quieter, the laughter fades, the warmth that once held them together cools into an invisible distance. By 1979, after 12 years, the marriage collapses. Freeman is 42. His career finally gaining traction, his personal life in ruins. Divorce, he'd reflect years later, wasn't just losing a wife, it was demolishing a sanctuary I'd believed was unbreakable. But here's the pattern emerging. When relationships become inconvenient, when they demand more than Freeman can give, something inside him just shuts off. Like a light switch. Like cutting dead weight. This ability to sever emotional connections, we'll see it again and again. 5 years after his first marriage collapsed, Morgan Freeman meets Myrna Lee, a celebrated costume designer whose artistry brings life to stages. At 47, he marries her, believing he's found the anchor that eluded him before. For a time it works. Myrna isn't dazzled by his growing fame. She offers something rarer, steadiness. They build a life in Mississippi, not in Hollywood's glare, but on 124 acres of ancestral soil. A sprawling estate with wraparound porches, ancient oaks, and the quiet hum of cicadas. This is where Freeman's 4 children, Alfonso Dina, Morgana, and Saifullah, come during holidays. Where they bring his step-granddaughter, Edina Hines, whose laughter fills halls that had known too much silence. For Freeman, this feels like redemption, the chance to give his family the stability he'd never known. But beneath the surface, cracks are forming. By the late 1990s, Freeman's career surges. Stage, screen, narration, awards, global recognition. And with each step upward, the distance at home widens. Myrna begins to feel like a woman married to a ghost. The man she married is never home. Dinners grow cold waiting for him. Holidays feel hollow. The long wooden table that once echoed with conversation grows silent. I gave him my years, she'd later confide to a friend, and in return I learned that silence can be louder than fame. She'd built her life around his, woven her identity into his success, and now she was unraveling, thread by thread, in a house that had promised permanence. By 2007, after 23 years, Myrna filed for divorce. The proceedings were brutal. Public, one of the costliest divorces in Hollywood history, estimates ranging from $100 million to $200 million. But the real cost wasn't financial. It was the children watching their home splinter. It was Edina Hines, the step-granddaughter, who'd believed in the permanence of family, now learning that even the strongest bonds can unravel. Freeman would later reflect, the hardest part of any success is realizing what it cost you along the way. But here's what's chilling. He never remarried, never tried again, as if he'd learned something darker than heartbreak. That love for him was incompatible with greatness. That to be the voice of God required sacrificing the warmth of being human. August 3, 2008. A quiet Mississippi night. Morgan Freeman is driving near Ruleville. Then impact. His car veers off the highway. Flips. Again and again. Metal screaming. Glass exploding. The world turning into a kaleidoscope of destruction. When the chaos stops, Freeman is trapped in the wreckage. Emergency crews arrive with hydraulic tools, fighting to free him like they're rescuing a man from the jaws of fate itself. The injuries are catastrophic. Left arm shattered, elbow destroyed, shoulder torn, nerves so damaged that surgeons labor for nearly 4 hours to piece him back together. He survives, but survival comes with a price that will last the rest of his life. His left hand, once steady enough to pilot aircraft, is now partially paralyzed. Circulation falters, forcing him to wear a compression glove to control swelling. And then comes the invisible torment. Fibromyalgia, a nerve condition that delivers sharp burning pain that never stops. Not when he's sleeping, not when he's filming, not ever. I suffer pain every single day, he'd later admit. Think about that. The man whose voice narrated the universe itself now lives with constant, unrelenting agony. The activities that once defined his freedom, piloting planes, sailing oceans, riding horses, are now locked behind doors. His body can no longer open. Nights bring no peace. He lies awake, the throb in his arm refusing him rest, staring at a hand that no longer obeys. The compression glove becomes more than a medical device. It becomes a symbol, the visible mark of a battle he'll fight until he dies. But the cruelest irony, the world sees a man who appears unbreakable. Red carpets, award shows, that calm, dignified presence. Nobody sees the pain. Nobody sees the exhaustion. Nobody sees the man who can barely sleep through the night. The voice that comforted millions in the Shawshank Redemption. Hope is a good thing, maybe the best of things, now belongs to a man imprisoned in his own body. August 16, 2015. If the car accident broke Morgan Freeman's body, this moment broke his soul. Edina Hines, his step-granddaughter, the young woman he'd raised like a daughter, is murdered on a New York street, stabbed to death at just 33 years old. She'd walked beside him on red carpets, sat across from him at family dinners, leaned on his guidance as she chased her own artistic dreams. Her laughter had filled his Mississippi home with a sound he thought he'd lost forever, the pure, unguarded joy of family. And in one merciless instant, it was extinguished. The world saw headlines. Freeman saw the end of his world. She was a star that will forever shine in my heart, he told the public. But those close to him saw something else, a grandfather whose eyes now carried an unbearable weight, as if part of him had been buried with her. For a man who'd already endured poverty, broken marriages and physical devastation, this was the wound that wouldn't heal. The rooms that had once echoed with Edina's presence became haunted by her absence. Every holiday without her, every empty chair at the table, every milestone she'd never reach. This is the cruelest paradox of Freeman's life. The man who gave voice to hope couldn't protect himself from grief's crushing silence. Just as Freeman is learning to live with grief and pain, another blow arrives, this one to his reputation. A major news outlet publishes allegations from multiple women claiming Freeman made them uncomfortable with inappropriate remarks and behavior during his years as a powerful director and producer. The voice that symbolized dignity and wisdom suddenly trembles under suspicion. Freeman denies intent to harm. I have never intended to make anyone feel uncomfortable, and if I did, I apologize. No charges are filed. His lawyers demand corrections, but the damage is done. For a man whose career was built on portraying integrity itself, this is devastating. The applause of decades can't drown out whispers of doubt. And then there are the business failures. 2006, Clickstar, his ambitious streaming company, collapses within a year, burning through millions. 2016, the Ben-Hur remake, with a $100 million budget, and Freeman in a pivotal role, loses nearly $80 million at the box office. Other projects, Transcendence, Last Nights, vanish into obscurity with losses running into tens of millions. These aren't just statistics. For Freeman, they're reminders that even legends can falter, that even his presence can't save something destined to fail. Morgan Freeman is 88 years old. He owns 124 acres in Mississippi, a bee sanctuary he founded in 2014, where he imported dozens of hives and planted fields of clover, lavender, and magnolia. He co-owns the Ground Zero Blues Club in Clarksdale, a living shrine to Delta blues. His net worth, over $250 million. But he lives alone, never remarried after 2010. His children grown, scattered across America. Edina's absence a shadow over even his brightest days. In 2025, he lost another piece of his world. Gene Hackman, his longtime friend and colleague, passed away. I have lost not only a colleague, but a brother in the craft, Freeman said. The screen will never shine the same without him. He's watching his generation fade, watching the circle of friends who stood beside him at Hollywood's summit grow smaller. His body tells the story of survival. The compression glove on his left hand, the fibromyalgia that delivers constant burning pain, the fatigue, the memory lapses that come with age. Pain is my daily companion, he admits without self-pity. And yet he keeps working. Special Ops, Lioness 2023. Now You See Me 3, 2025. His narration in Our Universe, 2022. And Life on Our Planet, 2023. Each project feels less like another credit, and more like a farewell gift. In 2025, to mark his 88th birthday, he pledged $11 million to build a global animal sanctuary network. Giving, he says, is like planting trees, whose shade you may never live to see. So here we are, at the end of the story, Morgan Freeman sits on a Mississippi porch, surrounded by acres he owns but can never truly escape. The bees hum, the blues drift from Clarksdale, the oaks cast shadows in the fading light. He's worth $250 million. He's won every award Hollywood can give. His voice has narrated the universe, God, hope itself. But he's alone. 2 broken marriages, a granddaughter buried too soon, a friend lost this year, a hand that no longer works, pain that never stops. The man who taught us that hope is a good thing now lives with grief as his only constant companion. So let me ask you the question that haunts this entire story. Can a man narrate everyone else's redemption while losing his own? Morgan Freeman gave us his voice. He gave us comfort through despair. He gave us dignity when we felt small. But what did we give him back? The answer is heartbreaking. We gave him loneliness dressed up as legend. We gave him isolation disguised as immortality. We made him the voice of God, but forgot he was human. At 88, sitting on that porch with pain in his hand and ghosts in his heart, Morgan Freeman is still giving, still working, still narrating, still planting trees, whose shade he'll never see. And perhaps that's the cruelest tragedy of all, that the man who taught the world to hope never got to rest in his own. If Morgan Freeman's voice has ever steadied your heart, if his presence ever reminded you that dignity exists even in darkness, leave your tribute in the comments. For the voice that carried us through despair deserves to know it mattered. Subscribe for more untold stories from Hollywood's legends, because every voice has a shadow, and sometimes the shadow tells the truest story of all.